Okay, so in this video we're going to cover a combination of options 1 and 2, and the reason for this is straightforward. Option 1 went so badly wrong that its summary can be dealt with in a few lines. It was a tactical defeat, it had higher losses than either of the other runs, and ultimately it didn't justify any of the effort. So rather than dwell on that in a subsequent video, I'm going to contrast it briefly with option 2, the armour only push, and focus the main analysis there because that run at least produced a draw, and more importantly it brought out some very clear lessons in how I was using my force and how the game models the problems of Normandy. So hopefully more counterintuitive lessons that again are changing my view of gameplay. So the plan for option 2 was to commit the 23rd Hussars straight into Soliers without waiting for any infantry, and the idea was to bound forward troop by troop using suppressive fire on the buildings as we advanced, and at the same time we're going to maintain balance in case a German counterattack came the other way. So the theory being we're seizing ground a bit more quickly, and then we're also being ready to fight the Germans on their way back in. Now this was a gamble, but in respect to the outcome, it worked the best. So we did gain more ground in Soliers than before, but that's not without some different problems which became clearer once contact was made with the tanks. Those difficulties though do reflect some of the challenges I'd read about in the Armoured Warfare book, and I suppose a bit more generally in the historical records I've been reading or listening to. We'll start by looking at comms or communications. So combat vision does seem to map communications issues to some extent. You can't really see what's going on behind the scene, but you certainly feel the effects. And in Soliers, we were to some extent punished by our own radios. What we're finding, I suppose, is that buildings, orchards, even hedges seem to be enough to sever the link between two sets. I won't turn this into a propagation lecture, but it's worth touching on why this happens. So radio propagation is basically how radio waves travel from one point to another, and on their travels they're influenced by all sorts of effects such as reflection, refraction, diffraction, absorption, polarization and scattering. Now these determine how a signal travels, and in the simplest terms, terrain basically can make communications difficult even over short distances. The effect in game was that squadron HQs couldn't consistently talk to their troops, and troop leaders couldn't talk necessarily always to their tanks. So what you would find is control evaporates and movement begins to stop. And again, because we're playing the hard cap rules, the only real way to keep momentum was to fall back to the initiative rule. So orders had to be broad, not precise, and you could find yourself saying, 1 troop, you move left through the orchard, 2 troop, you stick to the main road up to the crossroad. Once you give that order, the execution largely becomes out of your hand as they carry out those orders with a little bit of the initiative rule. I suppose the other way I had to handle this was just to throw fresh units into the fight. So initially we had B Squadron on our right, and I think it was C Squadron on the left, and they were both operating in their independent lanes, but they just reached a point where I could not, playing to the rules, really get them to keep up momentum, and had to throw A Squadron into the fray. This was actually quite an interesting mechanic to the game, and it sort of mirrored the historical British experience in Normandy. So wireless sets that would work fine on Salisbury Plain could become unreliable when you're out there in France. It's a story as old as time really, radios giving you a pain in the neck. As a result, what you see is sort of this friction, improvisation, and units having to fight semi-independently. The next point is sort of a vision versus protection, or to button or unbutton the tanks. I tried to keep the tanks unbuttoned as much as possible because of the situational awareness, which I saw as critical, but the cost was heavy, so I suffered a high number of tank commander casualties. Again, this pops up in the Armoured Warfare book, and I kind of agree with the experience from that book, so I would sooner have the commander situationally aware because of the importance of spotting. Once buttoned up, spotting ability dropped to almost nothing, and were already kind of on a back foot when compared to the Germans. So their optics, especially on the Panthers, gave them a clear edge. They would consistently see us first, and this sort of comes up later when we look at how that played out in ambushes. The next constraint was the physical space, so space and bottlenecks. Soliers filled up with wrecks almost immediately, the roads clogged, manoeuvre space collapsed, and squadrons were basically reduced to fighting on a single troop frontage. Of course, the Germans suffered the same with their Panthers, so these were forced into a single file through the villages and became vulnerable, so it did put quite a few ambushes in that way. Which brings me on to ambushes. So these are actually worth a closer look, because this is where I failed repeatedly, especially across the 3 different runs. In run 3, infantry was spotted before they could even fire, so the surprise was gone, the Panthers engaged first. In runs 1 and 2, I tried deeper concealment, so we put the Piats behind some solid cover, but it was often on a narrower field of fire, so we'd bought ourselves some protection, but made it more difficult to react. The ambush, in theory, is the perfect anti-tank tool that we had here. In practice, though, the timings were razor thin. We had to spot, react, fire, and if the Panther was rolling at speed, the window closed in seconds. It actually sort of reminds me of the basic training line that you used to have, which is, I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. So the lesson here is that the ambush isn't just about the position, it's about the readiness, the drills, reaction speed of the unit. And why is this interesting? Well, really it has me thinking a lot more about what makes a good ambush position. I think I need to think a lot more about my own team's speed and reaction, their positioning, the window that they have to fire on. I'd also like to reiterate the importance, because it felt like this was our best chance against the tanks, especially because I didn't think I had the same armour that the Germans did. But that sort of brings me on to the big personal eye-opener. So I had a little familiarity with the Armoured Triangle, which is firepower, speed and armour. I think the first time I'd seen this was in the Battle Group book, which is basically a useful way to look at a vehicle's capabilities. And then when you look at it in combat mission, it's got something similar with its simplified stats for defences and movement. And what I actually found with this was not what I expected for these adversaries. I was surprised to see on paper that the Sherman and Panther didn't seem that far apart in terms of mobility. In fact, the Panther was actually slightly better. And then armour-wise, the Panther does have the edge, but only really from the front. So finally, the Sherman is near enough the same on the defence stats that you see in combat mission, apart from the excellent rated front plate. The biggest difference then was firepower. So the Panther's armed with a formidable long-barrelled high-velocity 75mm gun, and this was the big factor. So it's what led to the higher likelihood of being penetrated, and it allowed it to destroy my tanks at long range often before the Shermans could get close enough to pose a threat. The Sherman 75mm gun was a decent weapon for the infantry support and engaging softer targets, but its lower velocity AP rounds struggled to penetrate the Panther's armour at anything other than very, very close range or in the flanks. I suppose as well there's this sort of imbalance in spotting. The Panther could spot first, often fire first, even with a slower turret, and would often survive more hits. And I think this is the confession point. I didn't know my own forces as well as I thought I did before the battle. I'd assumed I understood the Sherman's capabilities, but I didn't, not fully. If I'd gone back to the data, either in the Armoured Warfare book, or Corridor of Death book, or even just rewatched hapless testing vehicles on the ranges, I probably had a better sense of what I could and couldn't do. And that knowledge, I think, is probably going to feed into future planning, so I don't want to be discovering it mid-battle. But anyway, let's summarise the runs and their outcomes. So run 1, or option 1, ended in a tactical defeat. This was ironically supposed to be my best attempt, but it ended up in a miserable failure. And the whole idea here was to hold the 23rd Hussars until infantry could arrive and then push through together through the village of Soliers. Four was going to be left with just Piat teams, the machine gun company, and what was left of the 2nd Pfeifenvorfahr. And the remainder of F Company, which was under strength, riding in half tracks, was going to rush across to support the Hussars, guided by a troop from B Squadron. So these are the guys that made the initial contact. And the result, like I say, is a tactical defeat with higher losses than option 3. So option 3 was the charge through the centre. Four suffered badly, probably due to the lack of infantry, which was reducing the spotting ability, and Soliers fared little better. The delay getting troops across proved quite wasteful, so F Company's late arrival and the fact they were weakened platoons made little to no difference in Soliers. They were just too depleted to influence the fight. And this again raised some questions for me. So, was I already too late? Should Soliers have been taken before Four, right at the start, despite the larger scale of that task? Could we have avoided the gap entirely? I keep thinking back to the framing that historically the British forces were expecting to have broken through by this stage, but instead they're sort of mired unexpectedly in deep German defences. The gap wasn't expected to be the nightmare it was proving, but these are the sorts of things we started to think about. For run 2, this resulted in a draw, so this was a simple brute force assault that brought the best outcome actually, get us the draw. But reviewing post-game saves, I can also see that by the time of the attack, the Panthers were already advancing north through Bourguébus to southern Soliers. So the window of opportunity probably is already closed by this point, and we're already heading for a meeting engagement in Soliers rather than an attack that's going to punch through to the ridge. And then lastly, run 3, strangely, is the better defeat. So the 23rd Hussars run up the centre, ends up with a better defeat than option 1. There's not really any lessons I could take from this in terms of gameplay. The outcome's largely the same as the first run that we had by the B Squadron of Pfeifenvorfahr. Run 3 relied on this idea of a risk running through the gap again and failed because the opportunity it relied on didn't actually exist. There wasn't an actual opportunity to punch through in that gap to the ridge. So, in some senses, run 2, the high-risk brute force tank push, offered slightly better opportunity than this non-existent opportunity to even the tank duel. It's slightly more successful gamble because you're fighting on better terms, hitting flanks against the Panthers and making that tank duel slightly more even. In terms of the historical side, Operation Goodwood ended on 20th of July with British Armoured Divisions having advanced roughly 11 kilometres, but it failed to seize the ridgeline. Casualties were heavy in both men and tanks, though the latter were more easily replaced. Generally, compared to history, I think my attack fared worse in all regards. So my first assault was very, very clumsy, and I failed to respect the German field of fire. The smoke provided partial cover, but not enough to reach the ridgeline, and sort of subsequent quick plays of the opening battle revealed how deadly that ridgeline gun line was. The chances were never in our favour dashing through the gap to the ridge. The hard cat rules added some valuable new considerations, especially around command loss and order clarity. I probably over-applied these rules. We did see the errors that came up with ambiguous instructions that hindered my own units in their advance. I think I also misused my support. Beyond the initial barrage, spotting and calling effective fire missions were inconsistent at best. But yes, lots of questions that we come away with. Some I'll probably leave open given how much time it's taken to reach this point, but I suppose we could be looking at, could I have captured both villages instead of focusing on just one? Would prioritising Soliers specifically for that high church tower, which would have offered excellent observation and probably improved my artillery control, would that have been worth it? But inversely, could a regimental attack be based on a single key building in that way? Ultimately, Run 1 failed due to the unnecessary redeployment. Run 2 proved that a late brute force assault could work but lacked strategic payoff of the ridge. And Run 3 just confirmed that foolhardy manoeuvring up through the centre wasn't worth it. Maybe the takeaway is that sometimes a direct, forceful push, like Run 2's assault on Soliers, can succeed, where a more clever strategy collapses under its own complexity, as we saw with the on-paper better idea. But otherwise, it's another cracking scenario design. I do like how the scenario captures the opposing objectives. So the British objective is a single goal, the ridge, which sort of mirrors the historical drive to break out through the Normandy stalemate and this idea of maintaining momentum towards it. And then the German objectives, when you look at those, they're sort of layered defences across the three villages, so Soliers, Bourguébus and Four. And that sort of reflects their strategy, which is looking at attrition and delay. This design forces the player to sort of adopt the historical strategies in those respects. So the British players meant to keep moving, and the German is meant to hold and bleed the attacker. But in that respect, again, I failed to prioritise speed and manoeuvre. I think once the infantry had entered Four, and after that bloody loss of B Squadron, I probably started to hesitate in terms of pushing forward. But with broader reflection, this mission has been an education. I have started seeing Operation GOODWOOD everywhere. I can remember as a kid, it popped up once in a comic book on Operation Overlord, and it covered all of 2 or 3 panels. That was it. And even that focused on a sort of individual symbol of this plucky Sherman that rammed a massive German tank. But this scenario and the books that the authors based it on have been absolutely amazing. The Stackpole book has some absolutely amazing aerial reconnaissance imagery, and it really demonstrates the true scale and complexity of the battle, and it's just an absolutely fantastic high quality read. I've also watched a British Army documentary, which I believe is out there on YouTube, and this again offers a deeper look into the battle and the longer term impacts. So it highlights quite a few crucial lessons that shaped future doctrine. I think it includes the idea of the need for close infantry cooperation. So ideally, I think it's almost like a 1-to-1 ratio. It also covers the importance of better radio communications, the value of mobile reserves over static defences, and then the documentary also emphasises the unpredictable role of chance or an individual and their actions in combat. In fact, the lessons from this sort of directly inform subsequent British operations, such as Operation Bluecoat, which I believe we're going into next. And then post-war, interestingly, the battle's most significant influence seems to have come from the German perspective. So I've seen the battle likened by some to the Kursk in Normandy. And with the Cold War, this was a useful way to look at the threat of massed Soviet armour and perhaps some of the frustrations that massed armour faced logistically. But that's where I'm going to wrap up things finally. I hope it was worth the wait, and I won't say goodbye, just so long.